Welcome to the Writer's Dream. Our show is one where writers can talk about how they write their books, how they publish their books, and how they market their books. You can find us on YouTube. Just search my name, Linda Maria Frank, or The Writer's Dream. We also have a Facebook page, The Writer's Dream. If you want to be on the show or have a question, please use the message service on that Facebook page. Today we have a repeat visitor, actually three repeat visitors, Bernie Whalen, Bob Mladinich, and Phil Messing. And they wrote a book called Undisclosed Files of the Police. And this is a very, very fascinating book. Our host today is Jack Bilello, and take it away, Jack.
Thank you, Linda. And I'm delighted to be back because a couple of months ago we had part one of the interview, and it was so fascinating I couldn't really wait to have this opportunity to meet these gentlemen to talk about further adventures in that book, because the book reads like an action thriller, like a real crime thriller. I read the entire book, and so many of these stories could be and should be made into movies. Some of them were, as you gentlemen know. So I'm delighted to introduce you again. And I was wondering who should go first. So I said to myself, I want to be even-handed and well-balanced and almost scientific in selecting the first of you gentlemen to present some of these cases. So I thought the best way to do it would be something that I learned many, many years ago. 1 potato, 2 potato, 3 potato, 4, 5 potatoes, 6 potatoes, 7 potato more. My mother said, pick this here one. So, Phil. Okay, you can go first with the one that you first thought would be an excellent start.
Well, I think one of the chapters that fascinated me when I learned about it a long time ago, before the book even came out, is the trial and eventual execution of Lieutenant Charles Becker, who remains the only police official in America to ever be tried for a capital crime and sent to the electric chair. And it's a really interesting story on a lot of different levels, but the narrative is rather simple in theory. I mean, the intricacies are complicated, but the plot line is rather simple. In July of 1912, there was a guy by the name of Herman Beansy Rosenthal who was sitting in Midtown having a ginger ale, and somebody called him outside of the Metropole Hotel, which is, I think, around 45th Street or about, and he went outside and he was met by a hail of bullets and he was killed. And the interesting element of it was that the next day he was due to meet with the district attorney. It was Charles Whitman, who was going to explore the fact that the police department in New York City was involved in graft, and that he had firsthand information about having made payoffs to secure gambling privileges in the area of New York called the Tenderloin area. And within short order, he was faced with a problem. He had a star witness dead, and he didn't know what to do with it. So with the help of a very enterprising journalist by the name of Herbert Bayard Swope, who worked for Pulitzer's newspaper, The World, he was egged on to basically grant immunity to some people who may have been involved in the killing directly, were involved in the killing directly. And they secured the testimony of these people, and they locked up 4 of the people who were all executed. But the ringmaster of all this stuff was this guy, Charles Becker, who was a police official in the Tenderloin area, who was clearly corrupt. I mean, I think one of the most damning elements that was brought to bear in this case was that he had about $30,000 in his bank accounts. He was making $2,000 a year. At that time, that was an awful lot of money for a policeman to have in his bank accounts. But they told the story, basically, all these people, the 4 witnesses, that he had conspired to arrange the killing, and it was very sensational, the testimony. And within about a year's time, he was convicted. The trial was very one-sided because the judge at the time, John Goff, G-O-F-F, was clearly biased towards the prosecution. They had a do-over, basically. The Court of Appeals said that they had to give him another trial, and he was convicted again with a different judge, a guy by the name of Seabury, whose rectitude was well known, and there was no question that it was a fairer trial, but the same verdict and the same result, and he was sent to the death house. Now, the end result is that He protested his innocence till the very end, but within 3 years' time, this happened in July of 2015, 2012, by July of 2015. 1915, excuse me. July of 1915, it was 3 years after the initial murder, he was sent to the death house and put to, given the electric chair.
Yeah, very good. Might add that enterprising crime reporter has a lot in common with Phil Messing, because Phil Messing is an enterprising crime reporter for the New York Post.
I left.
Yeah, well, you retired, but many, many years. Like they, and yes, okay, Bernie, can you please tell us yours? You know what if I could, can you start with the case of Hans Schmidt? Because actually they met
In prison.
Exactly.
in prison. So please tell us the story of.
Another first,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Hans Schmidt was a priest, and he's the only Catholic priest also executed, also at Sing Sing, and one of his cellmates was there in the death house waiting. Their execution was Lieutenant Charles Becker. Schmidt emigrated from Germany. He ended up in New York as a parish priest on around 45th Street and Lexington Avenue. He met a girl there, Anna M. Mueller. She was a domestic, also from Germany, who come to America seeking a fame and fortune. Unfortunately for her, it ended up being as a domestic in a Catholic church rectory. When Father Schmidt gets transferred uptown, she follows him naturally, and they have a secret relationship that ultimately results in a marriage, a secret marriage that Schmidt performs himself and moves her into an apartment several blocks away from the church. So what is fascinating about it is that all this is unknown until a torso in a blue sheet washes up on the shore of Jersey. And the kids that find it, of course, are terrified, and they notify the police, and they don't know what to make of it. It's in a blue pillowcase. A couple days later, guys crabbing, grab another piece of the body, they put it together, it's been cut in half. Still no head, very hard. How are the police going to identify it? It turns out that the sheet was from, or the pillowcase was manufactured in Jersey, but some had been sold in New York City. And they alert the New York City Police Department, the Hudson County Police, and they take over the investigation, and they're able to trace the pillowcase to a shop in Manhattan. From the shop, they determine that who bought this particular pillowcase. They go to the apartment, and they find there's no one there. It's vacant, but there's blood all over the place. And in the closet, they find love letters from Anna Mueller to Father Schmidt. And one thing leads to another. They end up getting Father Schmidt as a result of that. And he pleads insanity. Alienists, which was the psychiatrist of the day, interview him, and they'd say he is nuts. He's a crazy guy. But in New York State, you have to prove you're crazy at the time. And the fact that he took all the trouble to try to clean up the death scene, to dispose of the body, and the next day to say mass as if nothing happened, showed that he was aware of things. He wasn't totally nuts. And as a result of that, he was sentenced to death at Sing Sing. The funny part is, he also was running a counterfeiting operation with a dentist in Manhattan, and they had plates and all sorts of things. And his dentist, who was really not involved with the murder, it doesn't know Schmidt is a murderer, he ends up going to the federal penitentiary as a result also. So at the end, Schmidt ends up in Sing Sing with Becker, their cellmates, and Schmidt does not deny it, although he does say that the reason he had to kill her is she got pregnant. And the abortion actually is what killed her. He didn't kill her, but he had to dispose of the body.
Another fascinating tale.
Crazy.
It's like, that old truth is stranger than fiction, and this is one of those truth stranger than fiction tales. So, Bob, can you please relate something that you thought was interesting in your own research?
Yeah, my coverage area was 1940 to 1980. I did a couple of stories post-1980 also. But one of special interest, especially at the time, was the case that came to be known as Dog Day Afternoon. and that's the early 1970s, and a man and a Confederate, they rob a bank in Brooklyn, Avenue P and East 3rd Street, and the motivation, you got to remember this in the context of the times. The motivation for robbing this bank is so the ringleader, John Wojciechowicz, can get a sex change operation for a man to turn into a woman or to transgender into a woman. And he decides to rob this bank and winds up becoming a major hostage situation that lasts for about 14 hours. And what's, other than the shocking facts for the day, the whole concept of transfer of sexual parts is the fact that Wojciechowicz was listed on TV. They had live coverage of this hostage situation for about 14 hours, and the news, very respected newscasters of the day were describing him as an admitted homosexual. So if you just think of that in the context of today's times, where all of this is perfectly commonplace, but back then it was so unusual. And then the whole thought of they actually brought this person that was going to get the sex change operation. They brought her to the scene of the crime. She had been in the Bellevue psychiatric ward for a suicide attempt. They brought her to a scene. But this Wojciechowicz was a very lively character, and he was taking money from the bank and he was throwing it, to the hundreds of people that had assembled in the streets, and he wound up becoming, a bit of a cult hero. So there were a lot of firsts in that case. All of the soap operas, which were very prevalent in that era, were turned off for live coverage from what was then the 4 or the 3 TV stations in New York. There was no cable TV back then. And a lot of people complained, a lot of women that were the predominant people watching soap operas back then were complaining. They were lighting up the lines at CBS and NBC and ABC about, why are you cutting my soap operas off for this criminal stuff? So there were a lot of first things we take for granted today. In 1971 was very novel.
Absolutely. And of course, this is one of the stories that you gentlemen have written, which was made into a major movie, Dog Day Afternoon.
Yeah, and the person, John Wojciechowicz, as I said, the ringleader, he wound up being arrested. His colleague in the crime was killed during the apprehension. But John Wojciechowicz wound up going to jail, and when he got out of jail, he actually returned to the bank. He tried to get a job as a security consultant at the bank. They turned him down. Then he wanted to get a limousine license and play the movie Dog Day Afternoon recurringly in the back seat of the vehicle so his passengers could watch the movie, but his parole officer nixed that idea. He wound up on welfare, public assistance, kind of down and out, kind of a very sad character, and he took to hanging around in front of the bank with a T-shirt that said, "I robbed this bank." And one day, some tourists or maybe some neighborhood people went by, and they said, "Oh, you're Al Pacino." And he said, he used an invective, but he said, "The heck with Al Pacino, I'm the dog," as in Dog Day Afternoon. That was the persona that he took after the crime and after his prison sentence.
Okay, it's fascinating, fascinating. Phil, could you tell us another one of your favorite stories that you were involved with?
Well, I also wrote the chapter on Son of Sam, which just basically predated by about a year by starting the newspaper business. But this was in the summer, between the summer of '76 and the summer of '77. There was a guy who nobody knew who he was. It turned out to be David Berkowitz, who was, basically called himself the Son of Sam after the fact. He didn't initially give up his identity, but he committed 8 shootings in which 13 people were shot, 6 of whom died. And they occurred all over the city. And the thing that I think the average person doesn't fully appreciate is the fact that when the police department is investigating murders or robberies or this and that, it's pretty mundane for the most part. But there's 2 words, I wrote this in the chapter, there's 2 words that all police commanders hate. and that is serial killer, because it only means a lot of manpower, a lot of overtime, and a frightened citizenry. And this is what basically became part of the myth or the legend of David Berkowitz and the Son of Sam thing. It was the fact that it occurred over the course of a year, and more importantly was the fact that he was taunting the detectives in letters. And he wrote letters that were very apoplectic, sort of, not apoplectic, but they talked about, he called himself I'm Mr. Monster, and they were very erudite. And Jimmy Breslin joked about, because he got some of these letters later in the case, which only fueled the hysteria about this case. And he joked about the fact that he was more worried about Son of Sam, that the fact that, because some of the killings occurred in Queens near Breslin's home at the time. And some people speculated that he may be working around that area because he had hoped to or intended to kill Breslin. And Breslin said, I'm not worried about him killing me. He says, I'm worried about losing my job because the guy is a better writer than most people in the journalism business. And it's a true story, because it was real. If you read some of the things, it's just frightening as all get out. To his verbiage and his turn of phrase, it's really, really chilling. And the fact that they couldn't catch him, and the fact that women, predominantly women, and their sweethearts or whatever were being targeted in lovers' lanes around the city was just an astounding phenomenon, because nobody knew where he would strike next or when he would strike next. But the police department took extraordinary efforts. They had about 75 people, had a Omega task force that was set up, and they did a lot of elaborate things that nobody even knew about. One of the guys, Joe Coffey, who was involved in the investigation, he actually set up an arrangement where if the shooting occurred, they would instantaneously transmit a message to all the bridges and all the tunnels in the city to be on the lookout for any car that looked suspicious. And when Berkowitz was being deposed after he was caught in August of 1977, after he had, soon after he committed his last of his shootings, he indicated that he had actually been stopped at one of the thoroughfares. I think it may have been at the Whitestone Bridge. I don't quite remember where it was, but the end result is that they looked in the car and they basically let him go. They didn't catch him at the time, but it was just chilling. And he was, to anybody who remembers the case, whether you're a defense attorney, a police officer, or a journalist, there seemed to be a unanimity of opinion that the guy was as crazy as a March hare. But because they wanted to dispose of this case as quickly as they could, when Berkowitz agreed to plead guilty to murder to all the cases, he was sentenced to, I think 6 life terms and plus, and he's, he's since has been undergone a conversion. He's like a born-again Christian. He works in ministries, and he's very apologetic of what he's done, but he's been turned down repeatedly for parole, as most people know, and there seems to be little belief that he's ever going to go anywhere out of his prison confinement except in a coffin,
And if he hadn't parked his car in front of a fire hydrant,
That's true.
you're wondering if he would have been.
That's what happened.
Because apparently he was planning a major shooting spree in Southampton.
That's right.
Over here, and had
indicate
rifles and guns in his car to do that.
He had indicated he wanted to, further, escalate his mayhem to like a mass shooting at a discotheque out in the East End, and they went through the tickets that were at the scene of the last shooting, which was Robert Vellante and Stacy Moskowitz. Vellante was blinded, and Stacy Moskowitz was killed. And they ended up finding they interviewed people that saw a car, and they said, well, let's go look and see if there was anybody who got a ticket. And they found, I think it was a Ford that he was driving, and they raced to the scene of where he lived in Yonkers, and sure enough, he came out, and he's alleged to have said, what took you so long? I'm your guy, or words to that effect. And he had this like sort of, demented grin on his face, and it was hard to imagine. He's just like a schlub that worked in the post office, but he literally ripped the fabric of the city apart. It's hard to, now we're used to well, not used to, but were somewhat aware of terrorism and very horrific acts and post 9/11 and so on and so forth. But at that time, this guy and his exploits really brought the city to a very unique state, you know, because there was actually palpable fear every evening.
Yeah, and then in that section in Berkowitz, you actually have the letter
Right.
that he wrote, a copy of that
Right.
letter.
Right.
Printed, Mr. Monster.
Yeah, Mr. Monster.
Monster letter.
You know, he says, I have to get my fill of blood, you know, Sam is a hungry lad, you know, and he needs more. I mean, it was something, you know, out of a Gothic horror novel is what I suggested, you know.
Bernie, can you tell us your other choice?
Well, in 1940, July 4th, 1940, the New York World's Fair was going on. In Europe, there was a war being waged between the Germans and the English, for the most part. And what happened is there was calls into the British Pavilion at the World's Fair. They had